don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but you can figure it out. A lot of you guys ask me, can you do a manual transmission and can you do a two-door? Well, this is both. This is a manual transmission two-door. Now you'll notice that I'm starting off on this hill and the brake hold worked. So when you let the brake off, it holds you from rolling back. That's pretty cool. This vehicle has a 525 horse LS3 in it, and it was built many years ago by Rock Solid Performance, and I gotta say it runs really good. We're going to be doing some not only updates, it's really not here for updates because everything seems to work. The only issue I see is the security lights flashing, and I'm not really sure why. I'll have to check that out. I can tell you this suspension's a little bit wobbly for the amount of power that this vehicle has, so we're probably going to look at that too. But really the customer's goal is he wants to run 5 seconds 0 to 60. Now while this thing runs excellent, it does have a an MVG 4500, which isn't the best performance transmission. It's a great transmission, it shifts great, but it's really more of a truck transmission. And we got some pretty tall gears in this too. I'm not sure what they are, but I mean, here we are at 70 at 2,000 RPM. So again, that's not optimal for performance, but it's running awesome and it's running cool. So this really isn't about fixing something or repairing something or updating something. It's about making this vehicle go faster. We got a two-door, which right off the bat means with that kind of horsepower, this thing needs to be solid. The suspension does. We don't want any torque steer, bump steer, brake steer, and we do have that. So one of the first things I'm going to do is try to address that. Second thing is we're probably going to update this transmission, but the customer wants a larger engine, and he's not far off. When we get this thing down to an idle, you're going to see it idles about 1,000 RPM. It's pretty rump. It's nothing that you can't handle. It doesn't really blow a lot of hydrocarbons. I mean, it's blowing hydrocarbons like any cam motor, but it's not bad. But it's very mild on the highway. I mean, you can see I'm just cruising along here at 1,600 RPM, and it's very nice. So this is kind of project 0 to 60. How are we going to achieve 0 to 60 in 5 seconds with this vehicle? And I would say let's go to an automatic. Go to a 6-speed, because this is an LS engine, or of course with a LT we go to a 8 or a 10-speed. But this customer really wants to maintain the manual transmission, so we're gonna stay with that. So I think what we're gonna do, and guys, I'm just test driving this thing for the first time. Like I said, it was probably built 5 years ago, maybe longer, and it has older Motec electronics, but there's no issues, there's no problems, so I'm not sure if we're gonna upgrade those or not. So the customer wants to go with a larger engine, because if you go with a larger displacement engine, it makes any cam feel milder, or you can go with a bigger cam and have the same drivability. So we're going with I believe it's going to be an all-aluminum 7-liter engine, which is basically a 427, and I love the 427 engine. I think they're awesome. Back in the day, the 427s were really the powerhouses in the GM lineup. Yeah, the 454s were pretty popular, but the 427 really revved up. I had a bunch of old 427 Corvettes, and they were like the 302s of the big blocks. And the 302 Chevys, if a lot of you guys know the Z28, they revved up, and that's what the 427 did. So we're going to go with a, now don't get me wrong, the LS 427 probably won't have the same characteristics as the small block 427, but what it will have is about 7 liters versus this engine's 6.2 liters, so it's over 10% larger, and we can run basically this a bigger cam and get the same drivability with more horsepower. So that's what we're going to do, number one. As far as the transmission goes, the customer wants my recommendation. The MVG 4500 is an excellent transmission, and we've done several of them, and they work out just fine. If you wanted to crawl, if you wanted to do expedition, or just everyday street driving, it's a good transmission. In fact, I would say it feels a lot better than the NSG 370 that came in the JK stock, the 6-speed. A couple of limitations of the MVG 4500. It is a 5-speed, it's not a 6-speed. So what we're going to look for is a transmission that has relatively low first gear to launch us off the line. This is not some lightweight Camaro that's 2,900 pounds. This is a 2-door JK, it's relatively light, but it's still going to be pushing 5,000 pounds. Then we want good close ratio. I don't know if you guys remember the old Muncys, the M20, M21, M22, but there was the wide ratio and the close ratio, and the close ratio was considered the better performance transmission because with the gears being closer together, if you could shift fast enough, you could keep putting that power down to the ground better than the wide ratio. But a lot of things come into play. What gears are you running? I was just driving a Jeep with, I don't know what gears it had, but at 70 miles an hour, we were pushing 3,000 RPM. And that thing felt like a monster off the line, but then when you get in the highway and it was revving way up, it wasn't comfortable. This Jeep, we're comfortably cruising 70 miles an hour at about 2,000 RPM. So that may not be the ideal gearing for 0 to 60, although it does make an excellent driving vehicle. I could cruise this thing long distances probably without much issue. In fact, going 80 miles an hour in this Jeep is really easy. It cruises nice, but what we're looking for is 0 to 60. So everything is a compromise. Do you want that low end power? Do you want that acceleration? Or do you want that highway cruising? And you can kind of get all of that with the new LTs with the 10 speeds. They're just phenomenal. You can get low end, top end, mid range, everything you want. But he wants to stay with an LS. He wants to stay with a simple engine like a LS3 based engine. So essentially what we're doing here is retro hot rod. And there's a Challenger right there. I have a lot of Mopar cars, including Challengers, and they had the old, I don't know if you guys remember the old hockey stick shifters, the old Hurst shifters. I've got one in my Challenger TA, and I love that car. 346 pack. The Camaro Z28 302 made most of its power at the top end, and we can make the 302s run with the 350s and the 327s, but we were pushing 8,000-9,000 RPM in those 302s with roller cams. You can make easier horsepower with the larger displacement engines. I like the 396s and the 427s. They were heavy engines, but they were easy to get bottom end power out of. 350 was kind of a compromise. I think the 350 was such a popular engine because it had good bottom end and it had good top end. So we're going to go to a 7-liter all aluminum LS with a manual transmission. We're talking 1960s muscle car. Biggest difference is we're going to have a 6-speed instead of a 4-speed. We're going to have 4 on the floor because, yeah, back then a lot of the vehicles had 3 on the tree or 4 on the tree, which means basically you were shifting from the steering column. And that was popular because a lot of guys wanted bench seats. They wanted to put 3 people in the front seat. Safety wasn't that big of a concern. But the 4 on the floor was really a performance setup. And by the time the muscle car era came around, late 60s, mid 60s, early 70s, everything had a 4 on the floor. Muncys, Borg-Warners, you name it. I always liked the Muncie transmissions. The close ratio M21, you could shift really quick. They weren't loud at all. The M22 with the straight cut gears had a lot of whine to it. But in the big blocks, we ran them. I got the LS6 454, and it's a real 1970 LS6. Got the build sheet and all, and that thing is just a monster with a 454. So that Muncie M22 was stronger, a little bit louder, but not much could really keep up with that LS6, except for the fact that it was hard to hook it up. If you're running on street tires, that LS6 really wasn't ideal because it would just fry the tires. But when we put slicks on it, we could run in the 11s and 12s at the strip. So that's what we're going to try to do with this Jeep. We're going to do a little comprehensive test drive tomorrow and just feel it out. Gordon at Rock Solid did a really good job on this Jeep. It's very solid, tight, shifters tight, no rattling. It runs really well. We did a Hemi recently with a Getrag, and it was okay. We did a couple of the NSG 370s, and you guys know that those are pretty sloppy shifters. We did a Tremec 6060 not long ago, and I think that's top of the pile. A lot tighter, shifts are very crisp. So this MVG is somewhere in between the stock transmission and the Tremec. I would venture to say that 90 to 95%, if not more, of the vehicles sold here in the States are automatics now, and there's good reason for that. The automatics have become very efficient. The newer high gear transmissions like 8 and 10 speeds have taken economy and drivability to a new level. Back in the day, the manuals outperformed the automatics There was less friction, less heat. Of course, you had to know how to shift. Things have really come full circle because after World War II, there was a scramble to make an automatic. There was a post-war boom of automobile sales, and women and guys that just didn't want to row the shifter anymore wanted an automatic. So 1 speeds, 2 speeds, eventually 3 speeds started to come out, and they started to replace the manual. But if you look at the 50s and 60s, there's still quite a few manual transmission vehicles out there, even in luxury cars and coupes. But as time went on, the automatic slowly supplanted the manual. The manual, while more efficient than the automatic back then, did require more special knowledge. You had to learn how to drive a clutch, which was a lot more difficult than just pushing a button. I don't know if you guys remember the old Chrysler push-button transmissions, but you could literally push a button, put a lever in drive, and just go with an automatic. And that was very appealing. So when the first automatics came out, the Power Glides and the early Hydramatics and Torque Flights, they were pretty good. But again, they weren't as efficient as the manual. As time went on, they added overdrive gears. You guys probably remember the AXOD, the 4L60, or actually before the 4L60, the electronically controlled transmission, there was the 700R4. They all had their version of an overdrive transmission. One of the big advantages of the automatic is torque multiplication. Big word for a simple thing, and that basically means that the engine and transmission are connected through a fluid drive. And you say, well, that's a bad thing because it slips. And that is a bad thing sometimes, but it's also a good thing sometimes. When you come to a stop, what's allowing that engine to continue to run with your foot on the brake with no vehicle speed is that torque converter. What's more, when you take off from the line, that torque multiplication helps. By allowing that slippage, it allows the engine to put out more torque rather than bogging down. If you were to drop the clutch in a lot of cars, you would just bog it down off the line. A lot of guys used to do what was called power braking, and that's where you load the converter. You step on the brake and the throttle at the same time, get some engine power built up, and then you let the brake off and floor it. And that's similar to what launch control is today. So the torque converter offers a lot of advantages for the automatic that the manual transmission doesn't enjoy. Now getting back to the slippage is always a problem because while it might be good while you're at a stop, it's not good when you're cruising down the highway. So in the late 70s, early 80s, I remember the Turbo 700R4 had a lockup converter. But it was just that, a lockup converter. It was either on or off. And I remember when we did our first 700R4 conversions, we just put a switch in. And when you got in the highway, you could flip a switch and it would lock the converter up. Now, of course, there was more sophisticated controls than that, like the ECM, locking the converter up under a light load on the highway. Or there was even some kits out there when you hit a certain speed over a certain amount of time, it would lock the converter up. But I like the manual control. I ran that for a while. And then as the torque converter evolved, they went to a pulse width modulated converter. So it's not just on and off, but it can slip as much as they want. And they use a pretty sophisticated monitoring system where you have an input shaft speed sensor, an output shaft speed sensor, intermediate speed sensors. And that way they can actually monitor how much slippage you have. You don't want to have too much slippage. You can build up heat, and there's other issues involved. But by doing that, now you can take a transmission with 4 gears or even 6 gears. Let's take a 6L80, and you can modulate that converter to get exactly what you want. Under a really light acceleration, you might notice that the transmission doesn't downshift, but the converter might unlock and give you that little bit extra power. Or you might notice under a light load, that converter will lock up without upshifting and drop the RPM. So the torque converter is a very easy way to control drivability. Now, we're not going to get into the dual clutches like the 6L80 and others that are just taking it to a new level. But that's essentially the principle of an automatic, is you got a gearbox with a converter or a fluid coupling that can be controlled, and that allows basically hands-off shifting. So anybody can get in a vehicle, put it in gear, and go. We've covered this over the years. I've done several manual transmission videos, but it just always seems to be something that pops up. This Jeep is from the Middle East. Now I'm going to go from 2 to 4. Yeah, it lugged it a little, but not too bad. So this customer wanted basically the muscle car experience. He wants the sound, wants the power, wants the control of shifting it. And a lot of guys say that. I've got guys that say, yeah, I know the automatic is faster. I know the automatic is better in traffic. I know the automatic in most situations is better off-road. I know I got a manual mode, tap shift, but I want that experience of shifting the transmission. There are the few rare instances where the manual might be better than the automatic, like trying to rock yourself out of the snow with a clutch pedal, or if you're going up a steep hill and the front end's gonna come up and over, you can push the clutch a lot faster than you can throw it into neutral and bring that front end back down. So there are some instances where the manual might have an advantage, but I think if you looked at the instances where the automatic has the advantage over the manual, the rational decision is everybody should be driving an automatic. But everybody has their own preference. So here's what you have to be aware of when you put a manual in. Most of these engines are not designed for manuals. Yes, the LS3 is. Yes, the LT1 was. But most of the truck transmissions, most of the half-ton SUV engines, they're all designed for an automatic. And if you want to put a manual behind it, you can. But just be aware of a couple of things. I talked about in a recent video that the Gen 4 and Gen 5 controllers get their vehicle speed from the transmission control module. So if you're not running a pure manual transmission tune, then you might be missing out. I think we discussed earlier about coming to a stop and the idle mode and all that. You can easily tune most of that stuff away with a manual transmission. Some guys want to drive manuals for economy. Some guys want to drive manuals for performance. Some guys want to drive manuals just because it's fun. So whatever your thing is, there is a manual transmission out there. But expect to pay a little bit more money or do a little bit more work if you want to integrate a manual into your swap. We've worked on several Hemis with manuals, and some of them have peculiar issues with things like cruise control, fan control. I think it has to do with the operating system. We really don't have a problem with the LSs as far as that goes. So this is a really good running Jeep, and honestly, I'd be perfectly happy with it. I know that a lot of my guys would be also. It just runs great. It sounds great. This customer, I think, loves everything about this Jeep, but he wants more power. And you know, it's interesting because this customer wants to go out and run this Jeep against other Jeeps and other vehicles over there, and that's half a world away. And I can only say that we're all the same. Well, I remember living in California during the hot rod era. It just didn't matter who you were, where you came from. There was people from all walks of life that were into performance. And now there's even more hot rodders out there. It's a global thing. I talk to guys in Australia. I talk to guys in Europe. I'm working with a speed shop in Moscow, in Russia. This is a worldwide thing, the muscle car, and I was lucky enough to grow up in California and experience it firsthand. But it's a fun thing to do, and when you take hot rodding and you combine it with Jeeping, what could be better, right? Well, I do still prefer the automatic. Maybe it's because I'm getting to be old, but the automatic just offers me things that the manual can't. When I'm stuck in traffic or I want my wife to drive the vehicle, and not only that, if you guys drive the new 8-speed or the 10-speed, they just take things to a new level. I don't care if you got 40s, I don't care if you got 42s in your Jeep and it's heavy. They launch hard, you get in the highway, and sometimes you're not in 10th gear, sometimes you're in 8th gear, 9th gear, running at 1800 RPM. I was just driving a vehicle that I was running 3,000 RPM at 70 with a V8, and it's just miserable. Tried going 1,000 miles like that versus going 1,000 miles at 1,800 RPM. Guys, notice how rumpity rump this idle is, even at 1,000 RPM. So you saw how rough this engine was at idle, but here cruising up the hump, it's perfectly smooth. And you say, well, why is that? And I've gone over this many times in my videos, but I know I got a lot of new subscribers, so I'll kind of explain it. To get more power out of an engine, we try to get more air fuel into the chamber. We talked about supercharging recently, and we did hit on the camshafts. What a camshaft does is controls the valves that allow or let air and fuel into the combustion chamber. On a direct injected motor, of course, the fuel is injected directly into the chamber, not behind the intake valve. So we want to get as much in there as we can, and by using a mild cam, we used to have what we called emissions cams with very little overlap. And what is overlap? Well, overlap is where the exhaust and the intake cross paths. Popular in the 70s, we were trying to get the hydrocarbons and COs down, and well, of course, hot rodders wanted to put bigger cams in, so we wanted more duration, meaning the valve would stay open longer, and the valve would open more. So it might, instead of a 1/2 inch, it might go 6/10 of an inch. It was called area under the curve. One of the issues is at higher RPMs, air is elastic and it can be compressed. So you have this very fast moving stream of air going into the intake. And you can use what's called the ram effect to actually close the intake valve after the piston starts coming up. So when you hit bottom dead center, the air is rushing in at a really high rate of speed. The piston stops and starts going back up, but the airflow or the ram effect is overpowering the piston coming back up at that point. So the key was to close the valve at exactly the point the air stalled, and then you would get maximum volumetric efficiency. In fact, with the big cam and ram stacks and all that, free-flowing exhaust, you could exceed 100% volumetric efficiency, which means you can actually cram more volume into the engine than displacement of the engine. Can-Am motors were really big on that. The flip side, though, is when you get to an idle, that ram effect is not there. The intake valve closes late, and it pushes that charge back into the intake, and it just messes everything up, and then you start blowing hydrocarbons and COs into the atmosphere, and that's not a good thing. So variable valve timing actually combats that by phasing the cam. We can't change the cam profile, but we can change the cam orientation to the crankshaft. So by advancing the cam, we can get better bottom end, and by retarding it, we can get better top end. I also want to give a shout out to Gordon Gilchrist over at Rock Solid. I think he did a great job on this build. This is the first time I'm seeing it after all these years, and this Jeep is tight, it's solid, it shifts excellent. He did a really good job on this Jeep. I try to short shift these. I don't know if you guys remember the CAGs, the computer-aided gear selection. That was really kind of a joke, but in the emissions and economy era in the 80s and 90s, basically if you weren't under a heavy load, there was a solenoid that would force you to go from like 2 to 4 or 4 to 6. I don't remember what the gears were. And that's kind of what I do if I'm just driving around lazily. And I don't even use a clutch a lot. I've been driving a manual transmission so long, I know how to synchronize the gears and I know how to double clutch, but like right here, I'm in fourth gear going 25 miles an hour. And even with the big cam, this thing pulls out of it no problem. I didn't have to downshift. So we're gonna go out and do a little bit of testing with this Jeep, and then we're gonna decide what direction to go in as far as the performance goes, and we'll see you soon.